Welcome, everyone. I'm Lisa Christensen, President and CEO of the Alaska World Affairs Council. We are thrilled to feature today, as part of our Evangeline Atwood Distinguished Speaker Series, Adrian Wooldridge, who was highly recommended by our World Affairs Council in Dallas-Fort Worth. And he's going to be talking today about his book, The Wake-Up Call: Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weakness of the West and How to Fix It. All of our programs are recorded on our website. So if you've missed any of our past programs, simply go to our website and you could listen to something we've featured in the past. Over 1,000 people are tuning in and listening to these recordings of our programs. Thank you so much for supporting us and for listening. And we're so glad all of you could join us here today in person. In downtown Anchorage, it's about 40 degrees and overcast, deciding whether it's going to be warm or rainy. And I hope the air is fresh and the water is clean and clear wherever you are today in the world. Please do say hello to us in the chat room. Tell us where you are joining us in from. We find it very interesting to see all of our friends who are joining in from near and far. Say hello to us and our speakers in the chat room. The World Affairs Council is part of 90 councils around the United States, and we welcome everyone to join in this conversation, to ask a question in the Q&A function at the bottom. Special thanks to our members and our supporters and our partners like the Juneau World Affairs Council, and our supporters like the Atwood Foundation, the Rasmussen Foundation, Humanities Forum, ConocoPhillips, Bering Straits, and all of you who become members of the World Affairs Council. It's members like you who make programs like today happen. So if you are currently not a member, please consider joining the Alaska World Affairs Council. You'll see a way to join in the chat room. Our next program, next Friday on May 7th, we will be featuring, as part of the American Academy of Diplomacy, Alonso Fulgham, who will be speaking about the value of water, investing in water infrastructure for climate adaptation. And now I'm going to turn over the microphone to Steve Lembeck. You might know him as a chair of the Alaska World Affairs Council Board of Directors, but you might not know his impressive background, which includes being the former general manager of Alaska Public Media, Swedish honorary consul for Alaska, associate editor of the Anchorage Daily News, and he drove 7 hours and slept in his car in sub-degree weather to interview Muhammad Ali. Steve will be introducing our speaker today. Over to you, Mr. Lembeck.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce a real figure in the world of journalism, Adrian Wooldridge. As you heard earlier, his subject today is his latest book, The Wake-Up Call: Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weakness of the West and How to Fix It. So Adrian Wooldridge holds down a big seat in world affairs and journalism as political editor of The Economist. He writes the Bagehot column, an analysis of British life and politics in the tradition of Walter Bagehot, editor of The Economist from 1861 to 1877. He was born in England, educated at Oxford, and he has a long journalistic pedigree. He used to write the Schumpeter column on business, finance, and management. He was The Economist's Washington bureau chief, where he also wrote the Lexington column. Before that, he was The Economist's West Coast correspondent. He was a management correspondent and Britain correspondent. His books have addressed a wide range of subjects, including business, psychology, and politics. He is the co-author of The Company, A Short History of a Revolutionary Idea, A Future Perfect, The Challenge and Hidden Promise of Globalization, Witch Doctors, which is a critical examination of management theory, and The Right Nation, which is a study of conservatism in America. His most recent books are The Great Disruption: How Business is Coping with Turbulent Times, and Masters of Management: How the Business Gurus and Their Ideas Have Changed the World for Better and for Worse. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Adrian Wooldridge, and back to you, Lisa, to move us forward.
Thank you, Steve. I see in the chat function, or the chat room there, we have some Economist fans out there. I'm joining you on that. Huge Economist fan. It is such a pleasure to have you here today with us, Adrian. And as I mentioned, you are one of the most popular speakers at our Dallas-Fort Worth Council. And just so you know, there's a friendly rivalry between Alaska and Texas. Everyone knows that Alaska is bigger and it's better. So we hope that we can entice you after this hour to come see us in person when travel opens up again and you're at this side of the pond, and come speak to the World Affairs Council in Alaska in person. You're on mute, so just click that mute button.
No, I'd love to come. That's a wonderful invitation. You'll find me turning up when you least expect me.
Fabulous. So we are going to talk today about your book, The Wake Up Call: Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weakness of the West. And this topic, for everyone here, I'm going to weave in questions from you. If you do have a question, put it into the Q&A function here, and I'll read some of your questions. We're going to have this conversation for an hour. The time is going to go by really quickly, and so I'll try to get through as many questions as I can. Our speaker has graciously agreed to answer any question. If you want to ask about The Economist, I see some fans out there, or about UK politics, he's willing to answer those too, so put those in and we'll link them through. You talk about in your book, Adrian, that we are in a period of a decade of not taking government seriously. So along with your co-author, John Micklethwaite, you explain why government matters in promoting liberty and democracy. You also lay out a call for action for sensible reforms that might just reverse these trends and rebuild the trust in our institutions.
What has happened with COVID is that we have been sort of like when you're at school, you sat an examination and the subject has been, how good is your government? The only way to cope with some big exogenous shock like this is to have a good and efficient government. And what we've found is some very uncomfortable answers. That we, I think, naturally in the West assume that we have the best government. Certainly in Europe, certainly in the United States, and that places like Singapore, China, the Far East are in some way behind us. And I think what we've seen with this pandemic is actually the weaknesses of governments in Europe, in Britain, in the United States have been exposed, but also at the same time, and crucially, the strength, the surprising strength of government in the Far East has been revealed. And I think if you look at the figures, as it were, the results of this examination, you see sort of at the height of the pandemic, a death rate of about 500 per million in the United States, 600 per million in Britain, and at the same time in China, Singapore, Japan, Korea, death rates of less than 100 per million. And although we don't entirely trust China's numbers, I think they're not out by a vast amount. Or if you look at actual cities, I think the number of people who died at the height of the pandemic in New York was about 28,000. In Seoul, in South Korea, the number was less than 100. That's a gigantic difference between cities that in many, many ways are roughly the same size, roughly the same sort of density, both very, of course, New York, obviously, but also surprisingly Seoul, very, very vibrant cities. So we've seen this global examination, and the results of that global examination have exposed the fact that the West isn't as good as we always thought it was, and the Far East, and most significantly of all China, are much, much better when it comes to government than they used to be. Now, this might be just a freak result of COVID, might be something to do with the health systems, but I think if you look more broadly at bigger questions of how effective government are, you see exactly the same issues being raised, that the quality of education, the results that you see in these global PISA tests are very worrying for the United States and very encouraging for countries like the South Korea and it's China, certainly Shanghai and Beijing, more sophisticated parts of China, also for Singapore. So we see a pattern of failure on the part of the West when it comes to providing government, and a pattern of success on the part of the Far East when it comes to providing government. And I think this really matters. Government is really important. It's important for saving our lives, obviously during a pandemic, but it's also because it provides all the things, such as education, that make for a civilized society. So I think that this could be a global turning point where Western government looks weak and governments in other parts of the world look much, much stronger.
Okay, I'm going to get to that, the weak and who looks stronger. And and I also want to get to China, but we have 25 students joining us from Bartlett High School who are part of the Chinese language program. So hopefully some of you out there ask some questions. Before we get to China and the weaknesses, I'm just curious. So is this topic something that was germinating in your head pre-COVID, or was it COVID that was the catalyst to write this book?
Well, both John and I, John was the editor of The Economist for a long time. He now works for Bloomberg. I remain at The Economist and have been there for 30 years. Both of us come from a sort of tradition which you would describe as liberal in the classic European sense of liberal. And we've always believed that small government is desirable, that markets and business are the engines of growth, and that government basically is not quite the problem rather than the solution, but is not the great engine of growth. But more recently, we began to think that actually government is much more important than that. Government is actually a precondition for growth. So we're beginning to move towards questioning some of the basic tenets of small government liberalism and saying actually government is perhaps more important than we'd imagined. So we were groping, as it were, towards that position. Then suddenly COVID came along, and we began to see that government is not just important, it's the difference between life and death. You know, a good health system, a good sound government response to a pandemic saves people's lives. You can see how good your government is in the death rates from COVID. So, this idea had been germinating, but it was, as it were, it was brought to fruition in this awful way by COVID. So we sat down and in what I would claim is a very remarkably short period, wrote this book, working night and day, just because we wanted to get the message across that government really matters. And because we thought that after COVID is dealt with, and it's slowly being dealt with, we wanted to leave a bigger message that if you want to be prepared for similar crises in the future, you really need to take government much more seriously than we liberals have been taking it for many decades.
So you say government matters, but how about trust in our government? I noticed you wrote in your book that the mid-1960s was not only the last time you said that the public sector was on par with the private sector, it was the last time that people in many countries trusted their government. Can you talk a little bit about that? Absolutely.
I mean, trust matters in the obvious way that government can get consent for what it wants to do. It can get enthusiasm from the population. It can motivate people to act if people trust it, if they don't regard it as something that's alien and that they're suspicious of. So one of the things we noticed was that Germany did significantly better at coping with COVID than Britain did. The trust in government, that the death rate in Germany was about 100 per million. In Britain, it was 5 times that. And I think one of the big reasons for that is people trusted government. They were along with what government wanted. Wear masks, for example, go along with government mandates, and also go to so obey these government mandates, and also enthusiastically rather than reluctantly go along with Angela Merkel's policies. But also trust is important in a second way. And that is that if you trust your government, you're likely to have good people going into government, intelligent, bright, innovative and energetic people going into government. And I think one of the things that's happened since the 1960s in Britain is that the quality of people going into government has gone down. Now, all of these things are a preface to me talking about the United States, which suffers from 2 huge problems. One is that the United States has now one of the highest levels of distrust in government in the Western world. And that's manifested itself in terms of people not going into government. The best people don't tend to go into the public sector. It's also manifested itself in widespread disobedience of public health issues, and it manifested itself in the election of Trump, who was openly contemptuous of a lot of parts of the public sector and the public health services and the advice that they gave. And some people have argued, some people do argue, I hear this a lot from Republicans, that this is just the American way. Americans don't trust government, and that's what makes America a great country. America puts its faith in business. It doesn't put its faith in government. That means that it grows faster. It means it has a tradition of liberty. I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think that in the 1960s, there was an enormous degree of trust in government, faith in government. Very good people went into the public sector. And you remember JFK making his inaugural address and said, do not ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That was and starting the Peace Corps as the result of that. That was a period of faith in government. If you look at the Second World War, America had massive confidence in government and was crucial to the defeat of Hitler. There's a mass mobilization. If you look at the late 19th and early 20th century, very successful government action to deal with poverty and health problems and welfare problems and things like that. So I would say that America has a tradition of having a very balanced attitude to government, not too much faith in government, as I think we tend to have in Europe, but not too much discontent either. And something happened from the Reagan era onwards and growing more intense in more recent years, which was the revolt against government became too big. It became too much out of control, and it's become counterproductive. And one of the biggest messages of this book is to the United States to say, look, you've got to have a more constructive attitude to government. You've got to understand that government can be a good thing, is often an essential thing, as with the health crises or the climate crisis, which we're seeing unfolding at a slower pace. And you need to send good people into government, give them the tools to do the job and trust them.
Well, it seems we had a program, our national office, featuring the Pew Research Center, and they came to the conclusion doing their research that trust in government was actually quite politicalized right now. You had, with Trump, you had the Republicans who trusted highly in our government and the Democrats who did not trust the government. And then that flopped with the change in the Biden administration, with a huge amount of trust in government by the Democrats and not so much by the Republicans. What do you make of that? Is that a weakness?
Massive weakness, because I think if you go back to the 1960s and trust in government cuts right across parties. It's a general thing. And you trust the party that's not your party in power. You basically, you say, well, it's not my party. I didn't vote for it, but they're going to try to do the right job. Now what you see in the United States is a terribly dangerous sort of polarization. And that polarization takes two forms. One is that you will only trust your own people in government. You don't trust the other lot. And the other is that you don't discriminate about what they do. So if you're a Republican and you voted for Trump, you trust him in government and you forgive him everything. You trust him whatever he's doing, however crazy, however bad what he's doing, is you trust him because he's your guy, he's your team. And exactly the same for the Democrats. The Democrats hated everything Trump did, whether it was good or bad, and they love everything that Biden is doing, whether it's good or bad. So that's not really trust, because trust means putting your faith in other people to be trying to do the best according to their lights. That's just football team support. You support that team, and whatever it does, even if you really know in your heart of hearts that I don't think that many Republicans really thought that injecting yourself with disinfectant was a clever idea, but they supported Trump, whatever. So that polarization is one of the, and I moved to the United States in the year 1997 and stayed there for 13 years, first in California for 3 years and the rest of the time in Washington, DC. And I saw that polarization just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And in Washington, when I was there, people of different parties just wouldn't socialize together. They wouldn't have dinner together, which everybody there told me was a new development. And that polarization started infecting areas of life which it had never infected before. It started infecting foreign policy, and there'd been normally, apart from the peculiar situation of Vietnam War, normally a consensus about foreign policy, that you would trust foreign policy. That was destroyed by the Iraq War, and now it's infecting public health policy, our policy towards COVID. So whether you wear a mask or not is not an issue of common sense. It's an issue of political affiliation. That's a very weird situation. I think the degree of politicization in America is far higher than anywhere else in the West that I can think of.
Before we move on to China, there's a really great question here from one of our audience members who's actually linking or calling in here from Russia. And she says, when you say government matters, what kind of government are you proposing? How do you see the people playing a role? How do you maintain accountability and prevent corruption?
A great question, a great question. I mean, the sort of government I would say is democratic. I think democracy is vital because I think it's important that the people should be allowed to give a feedback to their rulers. But it's not just democracy. That's not enough in itself, because many democracies can be corrupt and incompetent. It's also clean government, non-corrupt government, and it's also meritocratic government that gives the job to the best people, regardless of creed or race or whatever. So democracy certainly, but also clean hands and also meritocratic mechanisms of appointment. And I think one of the things that we really focused on our book was what happened in the mid-19th century in Britain, when you had, up until the mid-19th century, you had a very, very aristocratic, corrupt government that saw the job of the state as to give sinecures, to give jobs, to give privileges to rich people or well-connected people. And what happened in the mid-19th century was you had a series of reforms put through by our Prime Minister, William Gladstone, which were all about getting rid of corruption, saying you must have meritocratic testing, you must have parsimonious government whereby everything is costed and made cost effective, and you must make sure that anybody who's corrupt is driven right out of public life without any questions. That was long before democracy came along. So I would say democracy certainly, but anti-corruption practices very vigorously, and meritocratic promotion very vigorously. Those three things make for good government.
Okay, let's move on now to China. So the Alaska World Affairs Council, we've been talking a lot about China lately and the rise of China, and your latest Economist edition, which hasn't arrived in my mailbox yet, but it's titled The Most Dangerous Place on Earth, looking at the growing tension between China and America over the future of Taiwan. So my question for you is twofold. So one, is China rising or is the US falling behind? And two, could you talk about the balance between China and the Western world?
Great questions. The answer to the first one is both. I think the rise of China is quite remarkably rapid, and much more rapid than we ever expected it to be. If you just go back to 1980, you were dealing with a fairly backward society in which people riding around on bicycles, in which there's mass poverty and mass illiteracy, and a sort of shattered sense of institutions with the aftermath of the Maoist regime, and the creation of a modern infrastructure, bullet trains, the proliferation of cars, the building of airports. That has been at an extraordinary speed. And I think a lot of people have tended to assume in the West that all you've seen in China is really economic, technological progress. But I think there's been more than just economic and technological progress. China has done an amazing amount in terms of developing state capacity, in terms of developing a modern state, a state that can educate people, that has schools and also universities, which are getting a lot better very, very quickly, that can deal with sudden shocks like the pandemic, which they dealt with extremely effectively, despite the fact that it started there. That provides welfare, a safe welfare safety net. It's putting together all of the building blocks of national competitiveness. So I think China has risen much more rapidly than we ever expected. Secondly, China has developed in a much more malign way than we ever expected. We expected that China's rise would also mean that it would become more democratic, more liberal, and more benevolent. We sort of had this idea that to grow economically meant to become liberal and Western ultimately. And that certainly has not happened. What's happened is the Communist Party retained its grip on power, become more authoritarian in many ways, and more malign, more nationalistic, more xenophobic, more willing to assert itself on the global stage. So, we underestimated how rapidly China would grow, and we completely ignored the fact that it might grow in a way that was very inimical to the interests of the West. So that's a very bad performance on our part. And America is 25% of global GDP and has been 25% of global GDP for a long time. So America is still a mighty economic engine. Whereas Europe is declining as a percentage of global GDP, America is remaining rough where it is, which means it's not getting any bigger, it's not getting any smaller. But I think when it comes to politics, American politics is in a desperately bad state. When it comes to sort of the culture wars, I think America is in a desperate state because the two sides of blue America and red America just won't have anything to do with each other anymore. They're constantly fighting over things. And I think that political paralysis and that cultural paralysis will in the long terms have a very negative effect on America's growth rate. And I would say this is particularly the case because America sustains its current lifestyle by borrowing large amounts of money from the rest of the world. It's spending more than it's earning, and its entitlements programs are not being paid for properly, particularly Social Security. And that is a problem. Social Security could be, the budget could be balanced and the cost of Social Security could be paid for by raising taxes a little bit and increasing retirement age a little bit and lowering benefits a little bit. All of that could bring everything back into balance. But because the political system is so paralyzed, that can't be done. The Republicans won't vote for tax rises. The Democrats won't vote for raising the retirement age or the rest of it. So the whole thing is paralyzed, and that means that you're constantly underfunding these things, and because you're underfunding, so because you're borrowing essentially to be able to pay for Social Security, you're not spending money on bridges, roads, schools, and all the other things. You're diverting money to pay for this set of programs. So so that is my analysis. That unless something is done, China will get much more powerful. And as for the most dangerous place in the world, yes, absolutely, the South China Sea. China is much two very, very difficult players on the aggressive. It's got a big military, it's got a malign but highly cunning economy and a declining population. China, on the other hand, is malign, aggressive, but also has a huge economy, which is growing still at 10% a year.
This is something with our location here in Alaska, we think a lot about those neighbors. And also, but before we go on to that, Social Security, another way we say that it could be funded, fully funded, is to raise the cap on how much can be contributed by each individual into Social Security.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It is very frustrating. So back to handling of the COVID. So we're talking about some country and what stood out better than democracies when it comes to handling of COVID?
I think one of the reasons we wrote this book and wrote it at such speed was we wanted to deal with certain myths that if certain bad ideas became widely accepted, they would have very bad consequences. And one of those bad ideas is that authoritarian countries are better at dealing with the COVID crisis than non-authoritarian countries. And the result of that, logically, is that we should give government more power in the long term, because that's the only way that we can really survive in an age of pandemics and plagues and things like that. And I think that all rests on a false positive. it is the case that one big country has done well in dealing with COVID, and that country is authoritarian, that's China. But there are plenty of democratic countries that have also done well dealing with COVID. Taiwan, the free China, as it were, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, which is moderately authoritarian but not really authoritarian, have all done really well in dealing with COVID. So and also many authoritarian countries have done really badly at dealing with COVID. Russia did not do particularly well. Kazakhstan and all the stans have done badly. Turkey, many authoritarian countries have suffered. So I think it's a false positive. I think the real positive, the real correlation that matters is good government, effectively managed government. And you have some authoritarian countries which are good at government, despite being authoritarian. I think China is one of those. And you have some liberal countries, which in spite of being liberal and democratic, have not done very well at government recently. And I'm afraid the United States is one of those countries. So what we argue in this book is that the really important thing is good government, not authoritarian government.
Okay, this is an interesting twist coming through our Q&A feature, and that is, what is your perspective on how major corporations are aligning extra-governmentally to push their own agendas that are in opposition to civil liberties?
Major corporations, well, this is not a COVID question. Because I was going to say, when it comes to COVID, it's quite interesting how good the private sector was and how much better the private sector in general was at responding to the COVID threat than government. They were very fast, and they were very good at producing global solutions to the problem. But when it comes to anti-civil liberties, I'm exceptionally worried about this. I think there are two big threats to civil liberties at the moment. One is China, obviously, but the second is corporations that don't care about it. And those corporations, particularly the Silicon Valley IT companies, that have got a business model which essentially is based upon sucking up all of our information and selling it to advertisers or whoever will buy it. And they don't care about civil liberties. And that is exceptionally worrying, because now we have mechanisms that seem to hand over to people who need to set up systems which make it harder for that to happen. I think Europe, I'm very critical of the European Union in all sorts of ways, but I think the Europe privacy of information in this environment. I personally would not give my information, to Facebook, for example.
I was going to ask you about that. So let's talk about individualism and freedom. And that's something that's very important to people here in the United States.
Yeah.
So what do you think individualism, freedom, neoliberalism should look like during a pandemic and post-pandemic?
I think what you have to do is understand that there are no absolute principles that would lead you to essentially commit suicide. That when it comes to a pandemic, you have to be willing to surrender a lot of your liberties in order to save your life, but also, and more importantly, lives of other people. That the boundary of what the state can legitimately ask of you is revolutionized in a public health crisis. And one of the things that we talk about in this book a great deal is Thomas Hobbes's book, Leviathan, in which he says that the job of the state is to defend citizens from unnecessary destruction, either of themselves or of their fellow citizens. And that's why we create a state, what he calls Leviathan. We build the Leviathan in order to save our lives. And I think in a pandemic, we are doing exactly that. So we had lockdowns, which meant that we couldn't leave our homes. We had mandates to wear masks. We were told to queue in 2-meter distances and things like that. And I think all of that is absolutely legitimate. However, if that were to become a permanent state of affairs, even if the pandemic is tamed, that would be appalling. So you must be willing to surrender your freedoms to the government, but you must be absolutely determined to bring those freedoms back just as soon as you possibly can. So that's why it's vital that you have a democratic government, an accountable government, but also a government that supervises our freedom. You know, it's constantly looking to say, can we remove these restrictions? And also to link this to the previous question, also that is willing to look at other threats to individual freedom. So we mustn't be dogmatic, but we must be, because we have to change the balance, but we must understand that in an ideal situation, the balance is always in favor of the individual rather than the government.
Okay, so you said you wouldn't be willing to give your personal information to Facebook.
No.
Would you be willing to give your personal information to the government and let them track?
Yes, I wouldn't have. Pandemic, I'd be extremely reluctant to do that. And I would say my willingness to do that is conditional upon that government having, you know, oversight systems, you know, parliamentary over to protect the freedom of citizens. And I think now in this in the situation where we have, you know, governments, big data, governments and companies capable of tracing, of watching us essentially, you know, and gathering a huge amount of data. I think one of the fundamental things that Congress or Parliament should be doing is constantly watching to make sure that the companies don't overstep the mark. So we ought to have committees that are devoted to, just as we have, you know, committees that are devoted to foreign affairs and defense, we should have committees devoted to the defense of individual freedom from these rapacious corporations. I'm not fond of them.
Well, in many of the more authoritarian, oh my goodness, I'm just having a hard time with this word today. These countries like Asia that are, you know, there's more acceptance of the ability for them to say, hey, you have to turn your cell phone off, or you're censored in different ways. Is that because of the government, or is that a cultural acceptance on the people that allow for that sort of authoritarian government? And
well, I'd be quite careful about this because I would say that there are enormous national and local differences. That Taiwan, for example, is very jealous of a lot of individual freedoms because it's got China sitting next door. Even Singapore, there's a certain reluctance to allow yourself to be tracked all the time. And certainly in the South Korea has a very vibrant nightlife, a very vibrant culture. There's some of the most extraordinary and vigorous demonstrations I've ever seen have been in South Korea. So there's a lot of skepticism about having too powerful a government. I'd say they're more deferential, more willing to give over information, but partly because there's a higher level of trust in government. I would say the thing that really worries me keep coming back to this, but it's the big issue really here, or in history, access to the amount of information government has. And that, well, everything they do can be monitored. You know, Hayek argued that the great advantage of the free market over authoritarian systems was that the free market is a massively efficient information processing machine, and that governments could never be information processing machines in that way. But that was before the age of big data. And it may be the case that, you know, that the Chinese, with all of this massive amount of data that they can process at incredible speeds, will be able to get governments that are just really, really, really efficient. And I keep going back that, you know, the greatest book, in many ways, the greatest book in political theory written in the 19th century was de Tocqueville's book on democracy in America. And he looked at the world and he said, where is the future of the world? He said, the future of the world is America. And that is because America is defined by these two great values, which is democracy and individualism. And those are the values of the future. We're going towards a world in which old hierarchies will collapse, in which individuals will be empowered, and in which democracy will be the governing system of the world. And that was a very good prediction about what would happen in the 20th century. Now, if you had a modern day Tocqueville looking at the world and saying, where is the future and what is the future? It might well be the case that he'd say, well, the future is China, and the issues are not democracy and individualism, but top-down authoritarianism and technologically assisted collectivism. So I would say that my fear is that the future will not be the future of liberalism. It will be a future of sort of managerial, highly efficient, but highly intrusive authoritarianism.
Okay, so that brings me back to trust. So
Yeah.
we have a lot of youth who are here joining us in this program today. So can you maybe talk about how the youth trust government in different parts of the world? I'm thinking now China, UK, US. How are the youth, how do they perceive their trust in government?
Well, I think that the younger people are naturally skeptical about authority, and that's probably a good thing in some ways. But they also, younger people, are concerned about a range of issues which can only have collective solutions, climate change being the most important of those things. So I think young people tend to be conflicted over these things. On the one hand, they want big collective solutions, big collective problems. On the one hand, they think government is either boring or uninteresting or malign. And I think in some areas, you have extreme degrees of distrust of government. I would say one example, a lot of populism in Europe, for example, is driven by the young rather than the old. And particularly support for Marine Le Pen and the far right is very, very strong in France amongst younger people, because these people feel frustrated, they don't feel as though they've got any jobs, and they just want a radical solution to that. That's not the case in Britain so much. But I think that there is a wide range of attitudes, some sensible and some very dangerous.
There's an interesting question here in our Q&A about distrust in government and wealth inequality. The World Affairs Council, we just had a program on income inequality. And this question is, do you think the distrust of government is correlated to this growing gap in wealth inequality? The wealthy have more influence over government to make themselves wealthier through corporate positions and personal donations, etc. The poor don't believe their voice counts because of the lack of influence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say that if you go back to the time when people trusted government in the United States, the 1960s, that was a much more egalitarian time. And what we've seen since then is an enormous explosion in inequality. And I think high degrees of inequality make people distrustful of government anyway. But I think what you've also got is a system whereby the rich have actively manipulated government in the United States to make them richer. You know, they've created a tax code which is full of holes, which gives them tax exemptions in all sorts of ways, $1.6 trillion of tax exemptions, I think. You've got corporations that line the streets of Washington, D.C. with lobbying offices, which exist for no purpose other than to distort money and distort the public sector in their favor. So absolutely, this system of cronyism, crony capitalism, high degrees of inequality, a tax system which is very distorted, that leads to a lot of distrust of government, reasonable distrust of government, I would say, in that sense. But the way to deal with that is to, not to just turn your back on government, but to play an active part in trying to fix the system as much as possible. And we have been through cycles in the past. In the late 19th century, you had a belief in the United States that government was absolutely corrupt, and that the Senate was, called the Millionaires Club. Those were the days when being a millionaire meant having a lot of money. And somebody said of John D. Rockefeller that the thing that he refined much more than oil was politicians and political influence. And then with the rise of Teddy Roosevelt and the new progressives, you got a cleaning up of government. So it's not impossible to do it. Difficult, but not impossible. So I would say, we need more citizen activism on that front.
And let's talk more about money. So if you can talk a little bit about salaries and civil servants around the world. I think some people will be surprised about what you wrote in your book. I'm thinking about Singapore, Australia, the US, UK.
Yeah, one of the things that's happened in the United States is that you pay your public servants extremely badly compared with the private sector. And that gap between the public sector and the private sector has got a lot bigger over the last few decades. As I said, back in the 1960s, they probably got paid roughly the same. Now they don't. If you look, however, at the public sector in some parts of the rest of the world, you see people being paid much, much more. So the guy who runs the civil service, a senior civil servant, and somebody at the very top of the civil service in Singapore will be paid more than $1 million a year. You have people in Australia in similar positions being paid $500,000 a year or more, plus very large performance-related bonuses. So in the United States, and you've got a little bit of that in Britain, not quite as much, but people who are running big public sector projects like the HS2 railway line, which is a big new railway that's being built in Britain, are paid hundreds of thousands a year, comparable with what they would get in the private sector. And that rests on the idea that you need to pay people extremely well if you're going to get the best people to do very senior managerial positions. The other peculiar thing you have in the United States is an extreme compression of pay. So just as the top people aren't paid enough, the bottom people are paid relatively generously compared with what they would receive in the private sector for the same amount of talent and the same amount of work. So you basically say we can't have big pay differentials and we can't have the people at the top being paid too much. And I think both of those things are wrong. You need to pay the best people a lot and perhaps the bottom people less. And also you have a system in the public sector, virtual tenure. It's almost impossible to get rid of bad teachers or bad policemen. In Singapore, they get rid of them all the time, pay them more, but have performance-related evaluations, which are very tough, and a lot of people being dismissed from that job. So you've got I remember writing an article when I was based in Los Angeles about the rubber room, and they had this thing called the rubber room. So whereby if you had a teacher who was useless and nobody wanted to employ, they were put in something called the rubber room, where they would just sit and basically twiddle their thumbs and not do any teaching because they wanted to take them out of the classroom. But they just sat there and drew their salaries and accumulated their pensions without actually having a job. That would not happen in Singapore.
And then another reform in your book that you talk about is a recommendation to embrace digital and be more efficient. So how do you see government doing that? Is that a weakness of the West?
Absolutely a massive weakness of the West. One of the biggest gaps between the public sector and the private sector is the gap between the technologies of the two relevant sectors. You have two massive problems in the public sector. This is America more than anything else, which is that you have a very old workforce. So you have 5 times as many technology people in the public sector who are over 50 than there are under 30. And that is not the distribution of knowledge and talent in that sector, I can assure you, as my children will tell you. And secondly, you have legacy systems. By legacy systems, I mean systems that are not supported by new technology. So a lot of big government departments have computer systems that are quite literally out of date. You can't get the money to. The National Health Service in Britain is machines in the world, because National Health Service in Britain. And I think that you need to do big improvements in government in history have come as the result of new technologies. They came as a result in the 19th century as a result of railways and telegraphs and later telephones. We're going through another similar technological revolution, which could massively improve the effectiveness and productivity of the public sector. And we haven't got the right people. And to get the right people, you need to have a much more flexible pay system, and you need to start attracting younger people. And one of the other ideas that we have in this book, which I quite firmly believe in actually, is that we need to have a new system of national service. not military national service, not compulsory military national service. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, but a system of national service whereby everybody, when they leave school or university, have to spend a certain amount of time working for the government, a year, perhaps even 2 years, to give back to the government for, in terms of public service, partly to give back to the government, but also to provide a pool of talent, particularly in technology. If you had, a generation of people who spent, young people, highly skilled or educated in technology, going through the public service, would revolutionize the sector. And this is not quite as crazy an idea as it might seem. Macron is talking in France about reintroducing national service, and Sweden, I think, has just reintroduced national service because they're sitting right next to, they're worried about threats from Russia. So national service, I think, may well be the way of the future.
Okay, here's a question coming in, and maybe some of these ideas and reforms you're talking about in your book might be the answer. This question is, why, when we're talking about COVID, why are New Zealand and Australia outliers from the other Western countries with respect to COVID? Are they influenced by their proximity to Asia, or is it one of these other factors that you have been talking about?
I think proximity to Asia was part of it. I think they both are very, very good at government. They've been really focused on developing state capacity. And thirdly, they were very fast off the mark. One of the reasons why COVID got out of control in Britain, for example, was that we were just too slow to respond to it. We were too slow to lock down. We were too slow to close the airports, much too slow to close the airports, much too slow to mandate wearing masks. And New Zealand and Australia were the opposite of that. And they locked down in particular very quickly, and they stopped flights into the country, well, particularly New Zealand did, which was a very, very sensible thing to do. And I think being close to Asia was also, I don't think it's just that they were physically close to Asia, but they're sort of psychologically close to Asia. But one of the problems with Britain, and I think the United States, is we just don't understand how advanced East Asian civilization is. So when we saw them, when we saw COVID spreading there, and we saw them wearing masks, and we saw the hospitals filled up, we thought, well, that's something for them. They're odd people, there's odd things going on. Whereas both New Zealand and Australia said, well, if it's going to happen there, it's going to happen here. And we should have been saying that, the fact that in Britain, we didn't say, well, it's going to be here. The fact that we just said, quite extraordinary example of arguments in this book, is that when we're thinking about the world now, and when we're thinking about the future, about East Asia, we have to be thinking about their competitive advantage, because that is in many, many ways where the future is being forged in Europe and the United States.
Out of time, this has gone by so quickly. Question: why should we vote for Bill Lincoln?
Well, let me say who Bill Lincoln is. When we wrote this book, we thought we wanted to write a series of recommendations as to what sort of policy we should be pursuing. We thought, how can we bring this to life? How can we bring, instead of writing 56 recommendations as a list, how can we bring this to life? So we came up with the idea of inventing a character and telling him and finding out what we think he would do. And Bill Lincoln was the character we came up with. And he's called Bill Lincoln because he's a compound of two people, one of whom is William Gladstone, the great British mid-19th century prime minister, and the other whom, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. And I apologize if Bill Lincoln sounds a bit too much like Bill Clinton, because I think it certainly does. And I also apologize that it's a male rather than females, but we were looking at the mid-19th century. And the reason we were looking at the mid-19th century was that that was the last time when the West had a really massive revolution in government, in which you went from a really corrupt regime called old corruption in Britain, that's how government was referred to, as old corruption, to a lean, liberal, modern government. And we say we need a revolution in the 21st century as big as the revolution in the mid 19th century. And this character, Bill Lincoln, really is creating something which we'd like to call lean government liberalism. It's lean, it doesn't spend money unnecessarily, but it also believes in government and it believes in liberalism. You have to have a good government, but you have to make sure that government is always answerable to the people and accountable for what it does. So this was a sort of flight of fancy about what sort of leader we would want. And I would say, actually, I wouldn't want to be too political about this, but I think that the Biden has done relatively well so far in the sense that he's been thinking big. He's been putting too big in some ways, stimulus package, big policies. He has a very constructive attitude to government, unlike Trump, and he recognizes the extreme danger posed by the rise of China. So I would give him quite higher points than I would have expected.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm curious, you wrote an article about a year ago about headphones and college campuses right. and students who are walking around college campuses looking down. And post-COVID, do you see any switch that's going to happen with the headphone youth in society, or what?
I don't. I mean, in this article, I was really talking about sort of digital autism, that everybody is sort of in their own worlds, completely cut off from the rest of the world. I think there will be a quick, immediately we go back, we'll be pleased to see people and we'll be pleased to take part in a more social life. But I see us all going back to, unfortunately, to this sort of autism, particularly quickly. The amount of stuff you can get on these digital devices, the quality of the music or the talking books is amazing. I mean, I wrote this article, and ever since then, I've been walking around with headphones in my ears, becoming the very thing that I was arguing that we shouldn't be, which is an autist.
You don't think after COVID we're going to be craving talking to people?
A little bit.
At random.
At first,
we're just going to stop people and tackle them so they'll talk to us?
At first, yeah, I think that will happen at first. But I think we'll go back to old habits quite quickly. I may be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, actually, because I think it is antisocial, actually.
Well, thank you so much, Adrian Wooldridge, for joining us today. And I hope everyone buys the book. We have a link here in our chat function. The Wake-Up Call, Why the Pandemic Has Exposed the Weakness of the West. You can get it. And it's a quick read, about 150 pages, not too quick, but not too long. Great book, highly recommend it. And I hope we've enticed you to come to our great state of Alaska when travel is opening up soon.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Very kind of you.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us here today at the Alaska World Affairs Council and supporting our commitment to bringing quality education, programming to everyone, and increasing global competency. If you have any questions or suggestions, please send them our way. We'd love to hear from you. And warm thank you again to our speaker, Adrian Wooldridge. I hope everyone joins us again next week on the 7th of May, where we're featuring from the Academy of Diplomacy, Alonzo Fulgham, who's talking about the value of water, investing in water infrastructure for climate adaptation. We look forward to seeing all of you again soon. Have a great rest of your day. For you, Mr. Wooldridge, hope you sleep well. Thank you for staying up late in London and joining us all the way here.
Good night.